part of the evening. Our main guest today is Dr. Richard Milligan. It's Dr. Richard Millington. I do apologise, Richard. He was at the University of Chester. You'll probably correct me on that later. But Richard completed his undergraduate and postgraduate studies at the University of Liverpool. All the best people went there. Didn't support the team, but we actually went there. Richard worked at the university as a teacher. He's also worked as a foreign news editor for an international media company in Liverpool. At Chester, Richard lectures in European politics, culture, film, and literature. His interests include German society, contemporary German society, and the Cold War in Germany. His talk this evening is entitled, I can't read my own writing, I do apologise about this, Richard. Maybe you could give me the title when you actually start. So I'm going to hand straight over to you now, Richard.
Okay, thanks, David. I'll just share my PowerPoint with everybody then. Let's see.
That's up and running.
Okay, so today, well, the talk, as we can see on the PowerPoint, is a discussion of Ostalgie. So there's just my details there. So as David said, I'm Richard Millington. I'm senior lecturer in German at the University of Chester. And well, what I'll talk about today is what is Ostalgie. It's a particularly pertinent subject given that on Saturday, Germany celebrated 30 years of German unity. I'll explain what Ostalgie is, the origins of the phenomenon, what Ostalgie means today, because it's changed, transformed over time. And then just at the end of the talk, there's a lot of discussion about whether this thing called Ostalgie is just a bit of fun, or it's actually quite a dangerous thing for democracy. So first of all, Ostalgie is it's a portmanteau word. So it's a word made up of two other words: Ost in German meaning east, and Nostalgie meaning nostalgia. We might translate it roughly as something like Eastalgia. We could go for Ostalgia as well because we have Ostpolitik, don't we? It's used to describe the feeling of nostalgia and longing that some former East Germans have for the country in which they used to live. And now, how widespread is this? Well, it can be difficult to tell. What we do know is that a survey by the Konrad Adenauer Foundation last year showed that when asked about life in East Germany, 37% of former East Germans thought that many things were better back before 1990 than they are in Germany today. So not a majority, but quite a significant number of Eastern Germans today. Now, when thinking about Ostalgie, it's important to note that there's been more or less two waves of Ostalgie. So we'll start with the first wave. The first wave began shortly after German reunification in 1990. 1992 is usually cited as the year in which people began to perceive and take notice of this phenomenon called Ostalgie. Now, at the root of this wave of Ostalgie was the perception on the part of many Eastern Germans that attempts were being made to erase their identity as Eastern Germans, and attempts were being made to devalue their lives and devalue their achievements because they had happened in East Germany. Now, the German government at the time was led by the conservative Christian Democratic Union Party, and this party had always completely condemned East Germany before 1990 and after 1990 as well. And they had called East Germany an Unrechtsstaat, an illegitimate state. So in this period following German reunification, the conservative political establishment very much promoted the view that everything in East Germany had been bad, and everything to do with East Germany was inherently bad. They were supported in this view by the Bild newspaper, which is the most popular tabloid newspaper in Germany. It's the equivalent to the Sun, really, here. And before reunification, the newspaper had always referred to East Germany using several different names. They never really used the term East Germany. They would often call it the Soviet zone. Even into the 70s and 80s, they would use the term the Soviet zone They would call it the German Democratic Republic, which was the official name of East Germany, but they would have democratic in quotation marks, or they would call it the so-called German Democratic Republic. Now, all of these names denote the fact, obviously, that the newspaper refused to recognize the legitimacy of the East German state. And this continued after reunification. So they promoted the view that nothing about East Germany could have been good because it was a dictatorship in which you could not express your political opinions freely and in which you could quite possibly be killed at the Berlin Wall for attempting to leave the country. Now, faced with these political and media narratives, East Germans felt belittled, and they felt that their lives and their qualifications and everything that they had achieved were being devalued by the politicians in power and by the media in Germany. They were told that they'd lived in an illegitimate state, and so everything in their lives up to that point was somehow being devalued as illegitimate as well. The East Germany that they also read about in the newspapers or heard about on the television often did not match their experiences. So they would hear in talk shows, in popular history documentaries, they would read in newspaper articles that East Germany was being denigrated as a country of grey buildings and grey people and of stifling political conformity. It was often described as a country that smelt of industrial smoke, where people lived in constant fear of the Stasi, and you couldn't get a banana for love nor money. And there is some truth in that banana fact, actually. But one important part of this narrative also was that the West was better. Western cars were better. Western schools were better. Coca-Cola was better than the East German brand, which was called Vita Cola. So on the one hand, they were being told that everything about East Germany was bad, and on the other hand, everything about the West was good. And in those years after reunification, Eastern Germans perceived these things as attempts to undermine the foundations of their identity. And in response, many East Germans began to assert a new identity as Eastern German. They began to assert a certain pride in being from the former East Germany. Now, this is a natural reaction. You often become defensive if your roots and your identity are called into question or dismissed somehow as wrong or illegitimate. It's important to note that the people who feel ostalgia and who felt ostalgia at this time, they often had no love for the communist regime. They were not supporters of the communist regime, but at the same time, they didn't like the way that their lives for the past 40 years, the 40 years in which East Germany existed, they didn't like the way that was being portrayed either. Now, a few years after German reunification, an anthropologist called Daphne Berdahl, she did a study in an Eastern German village, and she undertook research in this village between 1990 and 1992. And this village had been on the east-west border. It'd been in East Germany, but right on the border with West Germany. And one very interesting thing that she found was that the working class women in the village in 1992 had begun to wear smocks again when they went to work in factories or when they went to work as cleaners. Now, these smocks had traditionally been a symbol of working women in East Germany, but they had not been worn by these women since German reunification because they were regarded as quite old-fashioned and not up to date with modern reunified Germany. But in 1992, these East German women had reached into the back of their wardrobes and were wearing their smocks again. They were using them as a symbol of their East German identity. They were wearing them because they wanted to tell people we are East German. And Berdahl also spoke to one family who had quite an amusing story. That they told her that they had relatives in the western part of the reunified Germany, and that every time they went to visit these relatives, they would drive in their Trabant. Now I've got a picture of a Trabant here. For anyone who doesn't know what a Trabant is, this was more or less it wasn't the only car available in East Germany, but it was the only car that many ordinary people had access to. And it's quite famous, really, because between ordering your Trabant and receiving your Trabant on your driveway, that would take about 8 to 10 years because the demand for the car could not keep up with the production capacity in car plants. The Trabant is also famous for the noise. It's got a two-stroke engine, and also for the fact that the chassis of the car is not actually made of metal. It's made of a kind of cardboard, plastic, fiberglass compressed materials. It's very environmentally friendly, apparently, in that way. Anyway, this family said they would always use their Trabant to drive to their Western relatives. Now, the interesting thing was they owned a Western car as well. They owned an Opel, but they always drove to the Western relatives in the Trabant. And the father of the family apparently proudly stated, we used to take our Trabant and we used to love parking it next to our Western relatives' 68,000 Deutschmark Mercedes. So they took a certain pride in asserting themselves in that way. Now, when thinking about this wave of Ostalgie, it's important to consider, well, where did this come from, or why did people feel that they needed to assert their identity somehow? And one argument that's often made is that reunification was not carried out on an equal footing. Many Eastern Germans at the time, and this argument, you still hear this argument today, felt that they were somehow colonized by West Germany. And proponents of this argument argue on the legal basis through which German unity was achieved. So in the West German Constitution, which was written in 1949, when West Germany was founded, there were two provisions for how Germany would be reunited if the possibility ever arose that the two Germanys could come together. Now, the first was Article 23. So Article 23 stated that a territory, so in this case, it was written with East Germany in mind, a territory could secede to West Germany, so it would become a part of the already existing country. So the West German constitution and law would then apply and be valid in this new territory. The second possibility was Article 146, and this stated that the West German constitution would cease to exist when Germany was reunited, and a new joint German constitution would then be drawn up. So in other words, Article 146 provided the means for reunification on an equal footing with input from East and West, and perhaps a mixing of the two societal systems, a mix of perhaps of socialism and capitalism. So that's what Article 146, that was the provision that came with that article. As it was, Germany was reunited on the basis of Article 23. So East Germany seceded to, and it technically became a part of West Germany. There were several reasons for this. First of all, it was the quickest way to achieve reunification. In the case of Article 146, a new constitution would have had to be drawn up, and this would have required a lengthy political and judicial process. And some people in 1990 feared that the window for reunification would not stay open forever. So they chose, or they voted in favor of Article 23 because that was the quickest way to reunite Germany. So with reunification being achieved, in theory, as I said, East Germany became a part of West Germany. The West German constitution was not altered in any way, and it now applied to the eastern part of the country. So the Eastern German economy, the legal system, the societal institutions and structures were all reshaped and transformed to fit the Western model. Now, this has been viewed by some people as a form of colonization. So, some Eastern Germans argue that reunification by this means simply meant that the Western system was imposed on them. They argue that no account was taken of the things in East Germany that were perhaps better than in West Germany. Some people might think, what's he talking about? Things were better in East Germany. Well, there were some things that were better in East Germany, according to the people who lived there. And one of these things was the provision of childcare. Childcare was universally provided by the East German state free of charge, which is not the case in West Germany or the case in Germany today. A childcare place was guaranteed for every single child in East Germany, and ostensibly this was so that women could have a career and a baby as well. And this had the effect that a great proportion of East German women had careers. About 80% of East German women in the 1980s had a job, and this compares with 40 to 50% of West German women in the 1980s. And in fact, I was looking at a survey the other day that showed that many women in Eastern Germany there are more women hold down a job or are professionally employed than in the western part of the country today. Now, it's important to note with this childcare example, you might think, oh, that's great, a childcare place for everybody. Some historians argue that the East German government offered every child a place in childcare so that they could start indoctrination from an early age. So that's the other side of the argument. And every creche, every kindergarten did have a picture of Erich Honecker, the East German dictator, on the wall. I've spoken to a few people who thought that Erich Honecker was actually their uncle. They were told it was their uncle on the wall of the kindergarten. Now, one particular example that illustrates this rush to impose the Western way of doing things on the East is the example of what's called the Ampelmännchen. We can translate this as the little traffic light man. And it's something that you might recognize if you've visited Berlin, and you see it sometimes in other German cities as well. Now, these were created in 1961 by an East German psychologist. The Western German, or West Germany, they had a different style of traffic light man. They had one that looked more like our one, whereas the East Germans went for the sort of cartoonish, jolly little figure. And at the turn of the decade 1990, German reunification, the Ampelmännchen faced near extinction. The German government took the decision that it would have a uniform system of traffic light men throughout the country, and that the Western German traffic light man would replace all of the Eastern German traffic light men. And this really became a massive issue for a lot of Eastern Germans. This became an issue of, was the German government trying to erase every last trace of East Germany from society by getting rid of their traffic light men? And actually, a campaign was set up called Rescue the Ampelmännchen, to rescue the traffic light man, and it was successful. So eastern parts of Berlin and Eastern German cities kept the East German model. And actually, if you go to West Berlin today and some Western cities, they've also adopted that model as well. But back in the mid-1990s, when this was proposed, this really was about, are they trying to get rid of every trace of East Germany from the United Germany? When we think about the causes of Ostalgie in the immediate years after reunification, we've got to also think about the effect that unemployment had on feeling nostalgia for on East Germans feeling nostalgia for the life that they had before 1990. At the time of reunification, over 4 million people in East Germany worked in approximately 8,500 state-owned enterprises. So as we know, East Germany was a communist system, so the government owned the means of production. The problem that 1990 brought was that the East German government ceased to exist. So the owner of all these enterprises, what was to be done with these enterprises? The German government set up something called the Treuhandanstalt, which means the trust agency. Trust not in the sense of having confidence in someone, trust just in the sense of a financial foundation. And it was the trust agency's job to oversee the restructuring of the East German economy, from a planned system to the West German social market economy. It was essentially the trust agency's task to assess which of the 8,500 state-owned enterprises could be profitable and sold off into private hands, and which of them had no hope of surviving and would not be attractive to private buyers. And those that were assessed not to be attractive were simply shut down. The trust agency was also faced with the problem that many East German factories were only running because of heavy subsidization from the East German regime. Many of the factories would simply not have survived in a capitalist economy. I've conducted a lot of interviews with East Germans, and many of them worked in factories, and they would tell me that they were working with machinery from the 19th century and the 1980s. So these factories a lot of them were inherently unprofitable, and were just not attractive to private buyers. That said, there is quite a bit of evidence to show that the trust agency mismanaged the transition between the planned and the social market economy, and a lot of businesses were shut down that actually could have survived. And just interestingly, on recently on Netflix, there's a documentary called A Perfect Crime, which is about the assassination of the head of the trust agency in 1991. He was assassinated by RAF, the Red Army faction terrorists. Anyway, but as a result of the trust agency's activities, 2.5 million Eastern Germans lost their jobs. The East German economy was heavily damaged by this, and there was a mass exodus of young people to the West. And you still see this today. The demographics of Eastern German cities are predominantly older people. Younger people move westwards looking for work because the big Western companies have still more or less kept their headquarters and their main operations in the western part of the country. Now, unemployment was an alien concept in East Germany because everybody was guaranteed a job. It might not have been the job that you wanted, but you were still guaranteed a workplace or a place to work. And you've got to think, is it any wonder then that Eastern Germans began in these early years after reunification to hark back to the days when they had job security and when they had certainty in their lives as well? And one of the East German women I've spoken to summed it up like this. She said, "Sure, we now had the freedom to go on holiday to Mallorca, but I didn't have a job and I didn't have the money to be able to do so." Now, it wasn't just jobs that made people look back fondly to their lives before 1990. In studies of Ostalgie, people frequently cite positive aspects of their lives before reunification and positive aspects that they think no longer exist in the United Germany. I've mentioned one of these things, job security. The aspect of life most cited, though, by former East Germans in studies of Ostalgie is that they say there was a sense of community in East Germany, which they feel has now been lost in the United Germany. There is perhaps something to this. Historians have found that there was a kind of us against them attitude that existed in East Germany, so the people versus the dictatorship, and this might have led to a feeling of greater community with fellow citizens. It's also important to remember that there was no such thing as what the Germans call the elbow society. Now, the elbow society is where you have to elbow people out of the way to get to the top. Thinking back to what I said about there was no competition for jobs because jobs were allocated to you. You didn't have to fight with others to get ahead in your workplace. This elbow society didn't exist. In other words, you didn't have to use your elbows, and this might have brought out a greater sense of community in Eastern Germany as well. In East Germany. We've got to consider also the poor state of the East German economy. This may also have created a sense of community amongst East German citizens because you could not get everything that you wanted all of the time. Particular items were always in short supply. Replacement car parts were always in short supply, and DIY and building materials were always in short supply. So if you wanted to repair the engine on your Trabant or you wanted to build an extension on your house, you had to rely on a kind of bartering black market economy with your neighbors. And as a result, people tell me that people were more willing to do favors for their neighbors to help out or to swap things with them. And this also fostered a closer sense of community in East Germany, according to the people who lived there anyway. Now, that said, some historians have wondered, well, how close could you have felt to your neighbor in the knowledge that they might have been working for the Stasi? So they might have been working for the state security service, so the political police. Did this sense of community really exist? If you take into the account that the people you were talking to, that confiding to, they might have been working for the Stasi, and the East Germans were certainly aware that the Stasi did exist, and that they were aware that the Stasi had informers almost everywhere. One East German woman has also said to me that if the sense of community in East Germany was so strong, and this community did really exist, then why did it fall away so quickly after reunification? If it was so strong, why didn't it carry on? I've got no answers for you on that matter, I'm afraid. Now, it's not just about feelings of loss of intangible things like job security or community. The East Germans feel a loss of the products that they used to buy as well, and this is closely linked to their identity. this is perhaps something that we can relate to. We might sometimes go into the sweet shop and think, I wish I could buy that chocolate bar that I used to buy when I was younger, and sweets that remind you of happier times in your lives. And this also created a sense of ostalgie amongst Eastern Germans after reunification, because they were confronted in almost immediately in 1990 with a very extreme form of this. Almost all of the products, brand names, manufacturers and packaging, all that sort of thing were replaced with Western alternatives. And quite literally, supermarkets and shops were cleared out overnight of Eastern products and then opened the next morning stacked to the rafters with Western alternatives. So the Vita Cola, the brand was gone, replaced with Coca-Cola and Pepsi and things like that. And at first, Eastern Germans, they lapped up these opportunities to buy the Western products. They had been able to watch West German television throughout the period of East Germany's existence, and they'd been exposed to the advertising on West German television. So they took the opportunity to see what a Big Mac tasted like, or to see what music sounded like through a Walkman, or to smoke Marlboro cigarettes. It's important also to remember, though, that they had no choice. They had no choice but to buy Western cigarettes because the Eastern brands had gone. And a lot of Eastern Germans, they enjoyed this opportunity. You sometimes, when you speak to them, they sometimes tell you about the overwhelming feeling that they had when they went into a supermarket, because they were not used to the colorful packaging. They were not used to all the adverts and the neon lights, and they felt it created a feeling of anxiety in them, the consumer culture that had been transported to them from the West. But after a while, many of them felt that they wanted their products back. They felt that the Western products, yes, they were fine, but they wanted to buy the products that they'd always been buying. And this created feelings of nostalgia for those products, because what we buy forms part of our identity. It tells us a little bit about who we are and tells other people a little bit about who we are as well. And what we get is as a result is in the mid-1990s, East German brands start to reappear in supermarkets in the East. And if you look at, for example, sales figures of Vita Cola today, that outsells Pepsi and Coca-Cola in the eastern parts of Germany still today. So they're still buying their washing powder, their cola and things like that. And we've just got some examples here. So I've mentioned Vita Cola, there's Club Cola. You'll find these in German supermarkets in the East. There's the Rondo. Rondo coffee was a coffee substitute. Coffee was very, very difficult to get in East Germany. In 1977, it was impossible to get. So Rondo was a coffee substitute. And what's interesting about Rondo coffee and East German products is that a lot of people in East Germany buy products now that they would not have bought in East Germany, because Rondo coffee is an example. So I've spoken to a few East Germans who would never have touched Rondo coffee before 1990, but buy it now because it reminds them of the time before 1990. And then on the right there, we've got Nudossi. That is the East German equivalent of Nutella. And apparently it's got no palm oil in it. So Eastern Germans try to convince me it's the more ethical buy. Shouldn't buy Nutella, we should buy Nudossi. Okay. Now that's the first wave of ostalgie, and that sort of subsided in the mid-1990s. It didn't go away, but it didn't really increase or decrease. It was sort of a constant. The second wave began around 2003 with the release of the film Goodbye Lenin. For anyone who's not seen it, I would recommend it. Ostensibly it's a comedy film, although someone has told me it's a tragedy rather than a comedy. It's about it's about a woman it's about a young man whose mother slips into a coma, and while she's in the coma, East Germany falls and Germany is reunified. Now, the young man's mother was a staunch supporter of the Communist Party, and her doctor tells her son if she suffers any sort of shock, then it will likely kill her. So when she wakes up out of her coma, he has to recreate East Germany in the little flat in where they live. So he goes around buying all the products and He creates old East German television programs and videos and all that sort of thing. And this introduced East Germany and Ostalgie to new generations of younger Germans and to international audiences as well. And it sparked a renewed interest in East Germany and a renewed wave of Ostalgie. Now, what I'd say now is that today, shortly after reunification, we had this first wave of Ostalgie, but today I would say there are two forms of Ostalgie, really. There's the authentic Ostalgie, so the people who buy those products because it reminds them of nicer times in their lives, or they buy the products because they've always bought them. And then the second part of Ostalgie is really the Ostalgie industry, which targets tourists and targets East Germany enthusiasts. So the Ostalgie industry really grew up out of the success of Goodbye Lenin, the German and the international success of Goodbye Lenin. So it promoted things like certain brands and the Trabant, and the Trabant has achieved cult status now amongst East German enthusiasts. But one key driver of this second form of Ostalgie certainly is tourists and tourism in Germany today. And a prime example of the Ostalgie industry is if we go back to the traffic light man. It's rather a grainy picture. This is the traffic light man's shop. This is behind the cathedral in Berlin, and you can buy over 600 products with the traffic light man on. So you can buy coasters and playing cards, footballs, you can buy pasta shaped like the traffic light man. The owner of the shop is actually a West German, so he bought and patented the design in 1995, and he turns over about £7 million per year selling products, all types of products with the East German traffic light man on. And now, when I speak to East Germans, I ask them, "Do you buy things with the traffic light man on?" And they say no. They say these things are for tourists. They might buy things like Vita Cola or Nud Ossi or Rondo coffee, but they wouldn't touch these things with a barge pole, really. They're for tourists or East German enthusiasts, or for people fascinated with East German history or East German design or East German culture. And one interesting example, this is the latest product that you can buy in the traffic light man shop, obviously the COVID-19 mask. So they're riding the second wave, I suppose, of COVID. Now, we've talked about Trabants and traffic light men t-shirts. Some people think this is all harmless fun. Well, other people, particularly prominent historians and politicians, don't think it is quite as fun as it appears. We've got a quote here from Joachim Gauck, who was the German president in 2011, and he called Ostalgie a danger to democracy. Now, Gauck was born in East Germany, and he was a prominent figure in the civil rights movement during the 1980s. And his opinion is shared by many people amongst the conservative political establishment, as well as the media and historians. And what Gauck says is that, or he's of the opinion that Ostalgie diminishes what German democracy represents. He says Ostalgie is selective memory and the trivialization of East Germany. And just to quote him, he says, "We risk losing the ability to distinguish between dictatorship and democracy." That's the crux of the argument, really, of opponents of Ostalgie. They think that it whitewashes East German history, that it makes the East German regime look harmless, and that it glosses over the more sinister aspects of the East German state. They argue that Ostalgie is East Germany without the political context. So without the Stasi, without the Berlin Wall and the barbed wire. And I suppose if you were to submerge yourself completely in Ostalgie, then you might gain the impression that East Germany was quite a fun, sort of kitschy, weird kind of place. But if you didn't go any deeper, you might think it wasn't maybe that bad there. But take, for example, the traffic light man shop. There's no mention of the East German dictatorship in that traffic light man shop. All you learn in the shop is that these jolly little men were on East German traffic lights. That's about it. When you also look at the products that you can buy in Ostalgie shops, and there are Ostalgie shops and Ostalgie museums in eastern parts of Germany today, then it's sometimes difficult to argue against the claim that this is East Germany without the politics. What we've got here are a salt and pepper shaker in the form of Erich Honecker, the second East German dictator, and his wife, Margaret Honecker. Now, Erich Honecker, as I said, he was the second dictator. He was one of the key people responsible for planning and building the Berlin Wall. And his wife was the minister for education, and she had quite a fearsome reputation. And this reputation, along with the fact that she had a blue rinse hairstyle, earned her the nickname the Purple Witch amongst ordinary East Germans. But you could argue here they're reduced to objects of fun here, and there's no allusion to the crimes or to maybe the more sinister aspects of their lives. Ostalgie shops also sell things with East German political slogans on and East German political symbols. So, for example, we've got a training jacket here from the East German National People's Army. You can buy East German flags. You can buy mugs with Communist Party slogans on. And it's these products that Gauck and opponents of Ostalgie have got the biggest problem with, rather than the fact that you can still buy Rondo coffee or Vita Cola. It's these products are reproducing political symbols, or that this is their opinion. They reproduce political symbols of an oppressive regime, and they claim that this commercializes the suffering that many people endured in East Germany. Some social commentators are a little concerned about what they call ostalgic narratives, particularly they're particularly concerned whether young people in Eastern Germany are exposed to these, and that these ostalgic narratives will colour their view of the past, and they will grow up thinking that the East German dictatorship really wasn't that bad at all. And if we include in this, if they hear a narrative also that that German reunification has resulted in nothing but unemployment for Eastern Germans and poverty, then social commentators and social historians are a little bit concerned whether this will impinge on younger Eastern Germans' respect for democracy. So what can we conclude from this then? Well, personally, I think Ostalgie tells us much more about Eastern Germans' lives after 1990 than before 1990. I've just got an interesting statistic here, actually, from that survey that I mentioned at the very beginning of the talk by the Konrad Adenauer Foundation. So they asked people, do you want the Berlin Wall back? So do you want Germany to be divided again? And 13% of former East Germans said yes. So 13% said we want the wall back. Interestingly, 14% of West Germans said they want the wall back as well. These are the views really of a rather extreme minority who don't think that reunification has been that positive for Germany and would much prefer things to be the same as they were before 1990. They don't represent the views of the majority of Germans. Ostalgie really then is symptomatic of the situation in Germany's eastern regions since 1990. So high unemployment, exodus of young people, a loss of opportunities. We've got to also add to this that this makes Eastern Germans feel like second-class citizens, and this feeling is often stoked by the media. Eastern Germans are sometimes ridiculed in the media as a bit backwards, as not quite as advanced as their Western cousins. It's also stoked by real-life factors as well. Pensions in the western half of Germany are higher than in the eastern half of Germany. Wages are also higher in the West. If a Western German bus driver earns more than an Eastern German bus driver, the Eastern German economy, after 30 years, still has not caught up. So if we consider then Gauck, Joachim Gauck, is Ostalgie a danger to democracy? Some people find it a bit silly. It's something for tourists. It can be viewed as whitewashing the sinister aspects of East German history. But I would say the majority of Germans recognize, or the majority of Germans are intelligent enough to acknowledge the crimes of East Germany while also being able to enjoy nostalgia for their lives before 1990. One thing that when I did my interviews with East Germans, I always asked them, did you have a good life in East Germany, and do you look back fondly to your life in East Germany? And they always said yes. And they gave this answer. They said, yes, I grew up in East Germany. I fell in love and got married in East Germany, and my children were born in East Germany. So why shouldn't I look back on those times nostalgically? And now I've just just finished the talk actually. I've just got some extra slides with some other examples. So on the left, this is the Sandman. So this is a famous East German cartoon. Well, it was like a stop motion animation character. He's become a symbol of Ostalgie. Really, you'll see figures of the Sandman on sale in Berlin and around eastern parts of Germany. On the right, you've got these East German care packets, so you can get these online, full of old East German products and sweets and things like that. A little bit like you can buy boxes of 1980s sweets over here. Sometimes people throw Ostalgie parties. I'm not sure what I think about this. People turn up dressed as Berlin Wall border guards, dressed as the former East German dictators. That's a little bit more close to the bone for me, I suppose. That's just my personal opinion. So these Ostalgie parties, and these also take place in the West. So you find a lot of West German students think it's quite fun to hold Ostalgie parties. And we've got this in Berlin, the Ostel. So you can book a room in this hotel and live life like it was East Germany. So this is the East German holiday experience. And then we've got a picture here. This is one of the bedrooms in the Ostel. So original furniture or furniture that mimics the East German style, complete with a picture of Erich Honecker over the bed. I'm not sure I'd like Erich Honecker over my bed, but that's personal taste, I suppose. And then finally, I suppose this is the most crass example I've seen. This is the chocolate Berlin Wall. You can buy this at the airport in Berlin, and you can buy this in several department stores. This is aimed at tourists. No self-respecting Eastern German would buy this, but this always jars with me because, well, over 100 people died at the Berlin Wall, and it's been reduced to confectionery. I don't really. That's the not very nice side of the Ostalgie industry for me, anyway. So that just leaves me to say, I should say Dankeschön, given I'm a German lecturer, and you can follow me on Twitter at DDR Online. So I just tweet anything and everything to do with East Germany. So I hope that's been quite informative for you today, and I'm happy to answer any questions that there are.